Hello and welcome to the Practicing Sustainable Psychotherapy training. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Oh, I'm going to turn my camera on just because it's recording my screen. Great. So I'll just start with a little bit about why I put together this training, which was initially for the associates and then now is being offered more widely at our practice. Obviously self-care is important for everybody, and therapists are no exception for that. But I feel like that conversation is pretty generic. We kind of all know what the principles of self-care are at this stage, and like doing them is, the hard part or the important part. But I feel like that's really, really well covered territory. And I actually don't think therapists, it's all that different. Finding our own boundaries, really choosing to do things that refill us, having well-balanced lives, those are essential for everyone. Oh, great. Welcome, Becca. And so as I was thinking about, what I wanted to talk about, the next kind of place my brain goes is like, okay, how do you manage like logistics effectively within a therapy practice? Because that has a big impact on your energy. Do you end sessions on time? How much email are you caught up in doing with clients? How much outside of session worries or progress notes or additional things are you taking on? And I really, I'm so interested in all these process mechanics and logistical things. Like my brain easily can fill into all of those. But I also don't think that's all that interesting. I think it's like can be challenging to do those things. Or once you find the reasons why it might be hard tend to be very emotional and often relate back to self-worth and deep attachment relationship styles. But I think, on the ground, it's like, yeah, you end sessions early and get a system for writing your notes that works for you and like bring your focus back into the clinical work directly as best you can. So again, I didn't feel like I have that much to say, even though I'm passionate about those aspects of practice and I find them deeply important in how I practice. And in training new therapists, often those things are important to develop. But again, not a super interesting topic to explore in terms of, look, I don't have a lot of new things to say. I think those are fairly down the middle. So today I was really trying to look at, well, what is like the bigger picture look at what makes practicing psychotherapy sustainable? What elements are even involved in that? If we're not just down in self-care as a person or the logistical, parts of the practice, what elements are involved? And that's kind of what I tailored this presentation and this talk towards today. So I am going to go ahead and bring up this PowerPoint slide, if I can find it on here. Oh, I think, okay, I'll just do this desktop. Yeah, we'll just do that. See how this goes. And then, great. And then I'll bring up this. Can you guys see this presentation? Okay, great. That's good. And then, let's do, where are we going here? Where are we? View. I'm gonna get there eventually. Slideshow. Oh, whoa, no. All right, I'm just gonna keep it like this. How about that? So
it actually looked really good, Marcus. Whatever you did before.
That was good.
With you guys too.
It says play from start on the left.
Okay, how about that? How's that?
That looks great to me. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then I think I want to make this smaller.
Nice branding.
Well,
we got our logo on here.
Got the logo. That's right. Okay. So I have the video screen on my screen kind of small. So if you do want to say something and I'm not noticing you, find a way to jump in because I'm I don't exactly haven't figured out how to track that while also paying attention to what I'm saying. But yeah, here we go. So I broke this into 4 parts here. I think therapy is very, very meaningful work, which is a huge reason why it is sustainable. A lot of therapists, practice for 30 plus years. So there may be periods of burnout throughout that, but that is really long-term, durable work you can do for an entire career. Also work you can do as a second career, regardless of the exact amount of years putting in. I then kind of transition into some pitfalls that can come out of it being so meaningful and often so close to the identity of the therapist as a person. So if the work is struggling, then it can be a really big struggle in the way that, say, maybe doing accounting or doing some other type of work may not have the exact same overlap between like identity and when it's going tough. Then social contact came up for me as a big piece. A lot of therapists are introverts, but beyond that, there's this really intensive emotional intimacy that we're doing on a professional level every time we're working. And so the appetite for social contact and how to navigate that outside of the clinical work, I think, is something I hadn't heard as much about as I, was been practicing. And so I thought that felt really important to me to address. And then emotional sensitivity, just dealing with a lot of clients' sensitivity and our own sensitivity. Swimming in this really emotional landscape, I think has a big impact, even if that's something that like I want in part out of this work, which I do. I'm drawn to that. I imagine a lot of you are. But it still is then something that you kind of have to reckon with or find a way to let go of or work through. It's really problematic if it gets too overwhelming or you have to go too numb to kind of survive all that intensity. So those are the categories I broke this down into. Classic, got a Carl Rogers quote here. Aaron, would you mind reading this one out loud?
Sure. I realized that if I were stable and steady and static, I would be living death. So I accept confusion and uncertainty and fear and emotional highs and lows because they are the price I willingly pay for a flowing, perplexing, exciting life.
And I especially thank you so much for reading that. I especially liked that last part of the second sentence. This flowing, perplexing, exciting life. And I often find the clinical work to tick those boxes. So, all right. Meaningful work. So the profession of healing work, and starting over on the left-hand side here, being a psychotherapist as a career is inherently meaningful. Session after session, day after day, year after year, you work with people who are wrestling with aspects of life that they identify as important. So sometimes an adolescent or a member of a couple may be brought in by someone else in their family. But the vast majority of clients that we're seeing in psychotherapy are choosing to come into therapy because something really important and meaningful is happening in their lives that they want additional support with. They're not just able to handle it on their own, or whatever the skills they've developed are not enough for them to feel like it is working. So I think it's important to realize that it is a big deal for people to decide to come into therapy. And they don't tend to do that just for some minor thing, or just for some small problem. So this work is meaningful to the client in therapy and the therapist hosting the therapeutic process. It's infused with personal and professional values that resonate with each clinician and highly encourages you to work through your own personal material. So I think, one aspect of the client coming in with this very meaningful work to them is that the therapist wants to then treat that as very meaningful inherently, as just a way to respect and acknowledge what's coming in. Add that onto the fact that most of us find the work in itself incredibly meaningful, have probably had our own therapeutic personal experiences that have been incredibly impactful. And it's just a space that is kind of infused and suffused with meaning. Many clients feel alienated from their work. This is often something that brings people into therapy. So in some ways, a therapist can be really ahead of the curve by modeling a relationship to work that includes a deep sense of purpose and financial stability. I think very, very often people have one or the other of those things in their work life. Okay, so that's all great, but then we come into the pitfalls. The downside of meaningful work. When it feels like therapy is not going well, personal material of the therapist is very likely to be activated. It's like real risk of this work. Periods of professional learning experiences can plunge the therapist into intense states of doubt, confusion, and self-critique. So something's not working in this very meaningful work, then the meaning making often goes dark and negative, and whatever your biggest fears and concerns are about what you're bringing into this work and this life get woken up. That can happen after just one client session goes off the rails, or sometimes there's like things seem to come in waves. And so several kind of complicated or difficult clinical situations show up, and it really starts to reinforce whatever, again, these shadow beliefs and are. So this can lead to real clinical struggle. So again, I've kind of just put this into 3 buckets. These are not comprehensive or really separate, but I just finding a way to kind of get at the texture and feel of how things can become kind of a downward spiral when it's not going well. Okay, so the ability to help is a helping profession. And therapists may count on the underlying belief that they can help clients in some way. So if you're not helping a client, this can start to get chipped away at. And if that's close to your identity of what you're doing for your work, that can be very problematic. Your sense of long-term stability, and this kind of touches into the financial aspect. Maybe I'm not good enough at the job of therapist to make it a viable career. I don't see myself as valuable. Clients won't see me as valuable. I won't make enough money. Again, when things are not going well, you're like, why would anyone come to see me? I'm not being helpful. It's not working. Again, doubt, really strong doubt can show up. And then degree of connection. So when you are used to connecting naturally with all sorts of people, as I imagine many of you are, it can be really distressing to experience more challenging relationship dynamics with clients. Clients who really are angry with you, clients who are push-pulling with you, clients who are asking for things that are confusing or not aligned, or you're not sure exactly what they're looking for in a therapeutic relationship. It's strange because I know I find this, I tend to be able to relate to many, many types of people. And so if that's not clicking, I mean, that's distressing to me because I'm just used to operating in a way where even if the other person is a challenging person, I can often make some sort of connection. And if I'm missing that, I'm pretty disoriented. And I can start to scramble, like, what am I doing, or how, uh-oh. So again, these are just kind of 3 areas where clinical struggle can start to show up. Okay. Social contact. It's an extremely intimate profession. It's very intense, big emotional experiences. It's very important material. Like, it's the opposite of small talk, chit chat. Well, there's a little bit of that here and there, but you're really trying to get into the deep stuff with most people. And a lot of therapists are introverts. Not everyone, but a lot. You like a quiet, one-on-one conversation, and really get connected that way. And so it made me think, like, well, what type of social contact are you interested in after a day of practicing therapy? And I see Riley, you're taking a deep breath, and Aaron smiling, Rachel cracking up. That's very nice. You have a partner or family members or friends. If it's a given Wednesday and you've had 15 sessions so far in the week, and even if it's going well, how much appetite do you have to connect with your partner or your family member, or to go out and do something with friends? I mean, the seasonality, of course, matters to this as well. Is it dark already when you've gotten home versus if it's still bright and sunny? It's not just only about the therapeutic interaction, but I just found this, it's just such a paradox of having all this intimate professional contact with clients that I find extremely meaningful. And then, do I want to isolate when I get home? Or is it lonely? Like, do I really have more appetite for social contact in my own personal life after doing all this relational work? Being a therapist puts you in a very specific social position. So you're like constantly in this kind of deep connective realm, and then like maybe more alone or wanting solitude outside of that. Maybe not, but or maybe hungering for some connection or to be heard and understood by someone else that is maybe not a therapist or is not necessarily signed up for that. How do you navigate that? It's just knowing all these things about human psychology and how people interact, but then having your own problems that may be just as difficult or entrenched as anybody else. It's just knowing a lot of things doesn't like solve all the things, which can also be frustrating or humbling and grounding. It just depends on how you're taking it in a given day, but it is very specific, like to be in that position. Let's see if I can go back. Also funny, like, I don't know what people tell you, but like when I tell people I'm a therapist, they either go, oh, great, will you be my therapist? Or they go, oh, how do you deal with people telling you their problems all day long? And no one really understands what you're doing as a therapist if you're not a therapist. I guess some people do who've been in therapy and but it's like there's a lot of ideas about what it may be. And it's not always something that you're going to feel like seen and understood by people outside of the profession in a way that's also just, I don't know, it seems to be part of the equation there. Okay. Emotional sensitivity. So, this work, emotional alchemy, and turning all the shit in life into all the healing, gold, growth. That's where all the good compost of the worst possible experiences, and like helping it grow into the most beautiful flowers and etc. clients can come in with really entrenched dysfunction that it may be working well enough, in their life. This person here seems to be working really hard at their computer and maybe has a migraine, and but these are things that are often been going on for a very long time with clients, where even if it's something that has serious problems for how they are operating, it's extremely stable and hard to just disrupt or to make, to help bring it out so that it can develop into something that works better for them. And so what can happen, there can be a chaos happening that you're helping them to bring containment to. Or in this example that I'm showing, this is a super like contained thing that can then erupt, as you start to get underneath some of the coping methods and ways of maintaining control, then much messier emotional states can show up that can be really unsettling, even if necessary for the client, like getting access to kind of what the deeper disturbing things underneath, beyond kind of how they're functioning day to day and keeping things together. And the fact that like we would see this as real progress from a client if they start to let themselves get this messy, while they would be really distressed by that experience. And then all of that discharge of emotional energy is happening with us. So even if we're encouraging it, wanting it, knowing it's there some way, really seeing it as progress, it's still a lot of energy that's coming out. And you have to find a way to kind of recalibrate your own emotions in working with those dynamics. So like again, this example, someone's been really stuck, but it's kind of been working well enough for them that if it continues, that's kind of like tense to work with that person, where you're like, I know there's more, but how do I get to it? Or they have this defense structure there. And then, maybe it's not so dramatic as just one explosion, but then you start to get to the mess, and then it's real messy. And they don't have a lot of skills in navigating that yet because it's new to them. And so things are coming around. And as a therapist, finding your way, I use this has some degree of order and motion to it. Finding your way for your own emotional state to kind of, I said, recalibrate, reset, whatever it is, whatever way you have of letting that material move through your own emotional material so that you can like restabilize in a way that's still dynamic and engaging and curious, but it's not also, if you're in explosions all the time, it's just going to be too exhausting to be able to keep showing up in that steady way for client after client. So this kind of, again, I've really simplified one aspect of this process, and there's many different, iterations of how something like that could show up, or again, you can go the reverse way, or there can be, I'm sure, different combinations of those things. But finding a way to move through that repeatedly as a therapist without having to get up and down and drained over and over again. Again, I'm thinking about long-term sustainability of practice. And if you're getting blown up and crashing down repeatedly, it's really hard to come back to have like a steady heartbeat to the work. And then it's even harder to decide, how do I want to engage in my outside social relationships? If I'm up and down, then I really have less ability to want to connect with people in my personal life, or to know how to navigate that. I may go more on autopilot into my personal relationships in a way that is, not as conscious as I might like it to be. So yeah, just a big impact of being within these different swells of emotional patterns. Okay. Riley, would you read the same quote again? That's from last time.
Yes. I realize that if I were stable and steady and static, I would be living death. So I accept confusion and uncertainty and fear and emotional highs and lows because they are the price I willingly pay for a flowing, perplexing, exciting life.
Thank you. And I just put it again in, I mean, I really like the quote a lot, but I put it again in because it has something of how do you have some degree of both the stable and steady and the flowing, perplexing, exciting. And there's no hard line there, but it's like there's part of what I think a therapist is bringing into the work is actually how to hold that balance of things. And for yourself as a practitioner, also as a model for the client, and also as like a thread to get you through a lot of different types of people and situations coming to your door. Like you have to have a through line of some way for yourself that feels like a connective tissue across all these different clinical presentations and personality types and uh, you know, really dramatic things, really hard to access people, all the different types of things that show up. And that is that. So let's see, I'm going to stop sharing. So yeah, I would, hey, Kristen, and hey, Kathy. So yeah, I'd love to hear whatever responses people may have, things that got your attention, and just kind of lead this into like a conversation amongst all of us.
One thing I wrote down was, as you were talking about sort of the emotional part of it, was like we've all had that where, for folks who've been to therapy as well, we've all had that moment where, and even if it's just a relationship you have, it doesn't have to be in a therapeutic relationship specifically, where you talking about the mess, the breakdown, where somebody said something pretty innocuous, but that for you was that straw, whatever the conversation was. And sometimes it's a volatile straw where you're like, I can't take this anymore. And sometimes it's just that emotional straw that makes you cry. It's kind of like when you're going through something and somebody's there for you and then they put their hand on your shoulder and you're like, that's the thing that made me cry. Right. Because they're connecting to you. And just that thought that like there's so much like in our relationships, how we think about engaging with other folks and where they may be at their breaking point to try and we see that sometimes it's really good. Sometimes you know, most of the time when I put my hand on somebody's shoulder and they've cried, I say, it's okay to cry. You may need that. You may, you know, they don't want it though, because they've been trying to hold it, but that release might be where they need to be. And you talked about that in terms of a therapeutic relationship where they've been using whatever mechanisms to hold them together for a long time, whether they are working or not working, because they're in therapy, likely they've seen it. Sorry, I muted myself. But when they get to the messy part, it's scary because like I don't want to release all of that at once. So I was just thinking about that portion, that, you know, that little straw or that one thing that has, you know, let the levees go.
Yeah.
And kind of along those lines, sorry if it's loud behind you guys. It made me think too, Tyshell, that when you talk about values coming in, Marcus's value, and like the value of calm, a lot of our clients are coming in like wanting to feel more calm and wanting to feel more peaceful. Like they're angry, they're coming in with anger, upset, or in distress of some kind. And it's, I know for me, it's been hard not to like kind of align with that value of overall just trying to calm down like and regulate versus like, oh, we're welcoming the distress of this change, or we're welcoming what, like I was struck in the quote, Marcus, with just the word accept. Like I accept the distress that's happening. And I think for me, it's been challenging to not to like align with the value of curiosity, and messy is okay. Like you're saying, Tyshell, like we're welcoming this feeling of distress. And as a therapist, welcoming uncertainty and discomfort have been big deals to me. From the sustainability piece of, instead of, oh, we're here to help everyone just feel good and calm down, and even myself in the session, like my job to calm down in the session. And instead shifting to like, oh, I'm here to be really curious that I'm not calm, or, accepting that this is really messy and this is uncertain and we both can be uncertain and that's okay. And the acceptance of that distress. I think that's been my journey with sustainability. And I don't think that was my value when I started. Unconsciously, it was like, they want me to be calm. I'm going to help them be calm, as opposed to, yeah, this is really messy and isn't that interesting? I don't know. So this through line of like curiosity has been helpful for me in that. When it feels really messy and in distress, like just for me, it's that like, oh, this is fascinating. I'm wildly disrupted right now. And it's, but that, I don't know, that assumption has been hard for me to wrestle with over the years. People coming in assuming I'm going to help them be calm, or I mean, whatever it is for you guys. But for me, I think that's been a through line of like, I'm going to feel really steady and calm because of therapy, as opposed to this is going to be really disruptive and maybe it's wild and ups and downs, and that's just normal. Yeah, the goal isn't to be calm.
It's like in some ways it's like easy for me to feel helpful if I help bring some calm. But it's like almost like I can't handle the amount of anxiety or disruption that's there.
1000%.
Minimizing it so I can also be in the room with that person.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell where it's like, oh, this is actually helpful to give some enough calmness to be able to look at some things and not just be totally dysregulated. And where it's like, oh, I'm doing this for my own comfort, right? I'm doing this unconsciously. Yeah.
Well, and for me, the curiosity feels calming. It's like that sense of like, instead of, oh no, it's like, this is interesting. And that's a calming experience in some way at a center. But I don't know if you guys ever feel that, but yes, that piece of assumption when someone's coming in, and the assumption of what you're going to be for them, and having to, not just jump in a line of like, yeah, I'm going to be helpful, I'm going to help you be calm, we're going to help, just, I don't know, it's easy to take on that for people.
I think it's interesting because when people think support, they think, so there's a theory in Stanford Nevitt in higher education. It's called the theory of challenge and support, right? I'm here to support you, but that doesn't mean it's without challenge, right? And that's usually through growing with adolescents. And I mean, I think it applies to all ages, especially, right? Because you want to challenge them and you want to support them at the same time. And challenge doesn't mean nothing, it means something. Like something could be happening. And when you were saying that, I'm like a very like internally visual person. So I was looking at I'm also a student of TikTok. Like I love TikTok. So I was watching this person, he's sailing around the world, and he was in the middle of the ocean by himself. And Riley's like, yes, I've seen this guy. So he's in the middle of the ocean by himself, left his boat, and he's on his paddleboard, and there's nothing. There's no land for miles. There's no sound. There's nothing. And even that is scary. So like nothingness is scary, and mess is also scary. And going back to that quote from Carl Rogers, like you have to go with the different changes. Sometimes you need quiet because you want to regulate we're always trying to regulate ourselves. So it's too much, I need quiet. It's not enough, I need more, right? But so you're trying to find that balance, and you're trying to help them. So, and I love that what you said, Rachel, trying to help them understand that both is okay. Like it won't always be calm, and it won't always, because even when it is calm, sometimes calm for too long feels really strange. There's like a room there's like a sound decibel room where you can't even hear a pin drop, and people can't they like challenge people like, can you spend 24 hours here? People are like, oh, I want to get away from my kids, my work, this will be great. And when you can't hear that, people report hearing themselves think, and even that feels weird because you can't hear a pin drop, you can't hear the sound of your own voice. So it's too quiet, right? So, and I love like breathing through and that through line of curiosity. How does that feel for you? What's coming up there? Do you think you need to be more here or there? What's really helping regulate you? And not that, and I always find that naming it, like I'm not here to like just say, that's good, but like naming the discomfort in the room is also okay. That's what making me.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. There's a lot being said, and I feel like I can't respond to all of it. But as I was listening to you, Tyshell, and then listening to you, Rachel, I was getting so activated, like just this idea of like sitting with calm. I was getting so agitated. And I think I try really hard to move with people with whatever's coming up, because I like this notion of like, there's a lot of talk about dysregulation and regulation. And I like this idea that the opposite of nervous system dysregulation isn't regulation, but it's expression. Because it's like, well, I don't want to be regulated. I want to be able to move with anger as it comes up in me, or I want to be able to move with fear as it comes up in me. Because that's not something to regulate, that's something to pass through, because that's a part of a path that's going somewhere. I mean, I have an incredible trust in whatever's coming up. And I'm thinking about yesterday, like a client was clearly getting angry and all this stuff was coming up. And I was like, oh, the word anger hasn't been used yet. And so I used the word anger, and this guy like basically like leapt out of his seat. It's like, I think that there's real significance in staying in dark places. And I'm often remiss at, you know, pockets of positive psychology that just want to feel good all the time. Like, I really don't trust that. But it takes a toll on me. I guess that's the last thing I want to say is like, I feel it in my body. I step very willingly and almost invite conflict with clients. I love conflict. I love fighting. I love seeing things out. But like, it's hard. And I think that I notice I'm like 5 years out of school and I still don't totally know how this work affects me. But I know it has to. But I guess I'm confused by these things. Like, yes, go with it, but also what is this doing to me?
Yeah, I love everything that you're saying, Riley, and it's making me think too, like even just how we hold what the work is and what the goal of it is so impacts like how at risk of burnout we are. I know in the kitchen one time you gently called me out of saying something like, oh, you know, like wanting to be like omnipotent as a therapist or wanting to be like all knowing or like this like perfect attachment figure or whatever, where it's like I know so many clients come in that like, yeah, like Rachel was saying, like wanting to be like the perfect version of themselves and wanting to be calm. And it can be so easy, I feel like, as the therapist to like get wrapped up into like, oh, I need to be like, I don't know, the perfect therapist, or I need to like go through and process all of my own personal stuff so it's not like impeding their work. When it reminds me too of like this past consultant that I used to see who didn't even really like the term healing, like to think about like, you know, but there's like a before and after and healed, and where it's I feel like a lot of what our conversation is about right now is like being so much more focused on like the process, or like Riley was saying, like the expression, rather than like we're going to become like a calm person and like things won't bother us anymore. Um, yeah, I know something like for me personally that I've been reflecting on lately is this idea of like the predisposition that I think being a therapist can put you in, of like your own stuff does get activated. And so there's just so many more opportunities to be aware of that. And then I can quickly have parts of me that are like, oh, I need to fix this. And then, you know, my loving husband will call me out for being like a self-help addict and we'll be like, whoa, just like enjoy life. Um, but I just even find that proximity of someone who's like, wanting to go through that expression, wanting to go through that healing, and how like contagious that can be, and just even their own desire to be calm. And then like I can get roped into that too, and yet also like emotionally slingshot around with all of the intense things that come up for clients, that it can really create such like, I don't know, emotional complexity.
Go ahead, Tish. We're both having the same time. Go for it.
So I was thinking about this. So I worked in higher education for a few years, and often working in nonprofit, you're kind of called to not be the therapist, but be a therapist for people, right? It's kind of like people say my hairdresser's my therapist, but in nonprofit, you're expected to like give of yourself. And there was a huge debate online when higher education, I think a provost or something said, if you're going to come to do higher education work, you need to be a happy whole person. And like everybody was like, that just doesn't exist. Life has its ebbs, its flows, its up and its down. So how can I be a happy whole person like that? If I'm starting from that premise, where am I growing or changing, or can I not bring myself to this work? And can that, it's so unrealistic. It's the same thing often people think for parents, right? People have an idea of their parent very often as this happy, whole, perfect person. And my parents got divorced when I was really young. So I just saw them as people who had children, but like they're still people. And then they had children, but they're still people, right? So I still see them in their mess and all of the things, but I saw that really early on. But just this idea of like, oh, if you're going to come to this work, you have to be a happy whole person. And that just doesn't exist. And it may exist for one moment of a time, sure, but it can't exist always all the time because so many things change in our lives. So I was thinking about that when you said like I'm a self-help addict, like, oh, what can I do? I'm always like, I love, like, my background is a really funny one that I found, but it helps me. It says your anxiety is such a lying ass hoe. And I was like, I love that for myself because like I'm an anxious person. So I'm like, oh, it's lying to me. Right. But like I have to move with it. Like, I can't, no matter what I do, I'm still moving through my anxiety. And it's high and it's low at different times, but I'm living with it. I'm thriving with it. This is why I always talk about mental health as a part of your overall health rather than be like, oh, somebody has a mental illness. And it's like, okay, but they're living with all of the things that are happening and not just this is one portion that we're dealing, as you said, like healed from or dealing with, but like it's a part of who they are and they're ebbing and flowing with it and engaging with it. So yeah, absolutely.
Just you saying, that you're an anxious person is like, so, I don't, that's inspiring to me. Like the things like I don't want to admit about what I'm bringing into the work. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm an intimacy junkie. Like I want the connection, and there's reasons about that that are just about how I am. And then also, my attachment stuff as well that are deeply in the work. It's like I value that connection so highly. So that's why some of the things then can be disorganizing for me if that's not getting hit for me. But I think, outside of my specific pattern there, it's like even admitting or saying these things is really feels healing and connective, among a group of peers here. Because I think there is that temptation in the room to be stepping into some sort of therapist role where you want to present more professionally competent or some version of that.
The
Where
omnipotence that Aaron talked about. Yeah. And it's funny because when you said earlier, so many therapists are introverts, I immediately kind of shriveled because I'm not an introvert.
Mhm.
If you've met me, I mean, even I'm sure you walk into, I'm an extrovert.
Yeah.
I know how to break out of a conversation though. So if we're in a conversation and I'm like, really gotta go, like I know how to do that. But when you said it, I was like immediately like some insecurity came up in me, like, oh, I'm not an introvert. Am I not the right person to be doing this work? And I just moved through that in the same way, like I'm open to share that I have anxiety and things like that. So just learning like, oh, well, that doesn't mean I can't do this or I'm not this. It just means that I'm different and that's okay. And learning and working with a lot of people for them to understand that like it's okay to be exactly whatever it is that you are.
Yeah.
Whether you love this or you don't like this, and that's you got to find the right connective tissues to be with people versus like trying to be like, well, no, I am perfect. I do this really well and I don't have feelings. So whatever you need, I will hold it for you. It's like that's not realistic.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. There's something like about just being specifically uniquely yourself in this work that seems to be the most potent. Like similarly to you when you withdrew when I said introverts, like Riley saying you like conflict, my conflict avoidance is like but it doesn't there's certainly no one way to be in this. It's like everyone has to find their own way into it, which seems to be the whole thing.
And Riley, when you were saying earlier, like it's been 5 years and I don't really even know exactly how this is impacting me or what. It makes me think of just, I feel similarly, like, okay, I've been doing this 15 years, and I'm still not always sure. And then there's moments where I am sure, and it's like almost like process content that we do in the session. Like, the content's happening over in a couple of years of the work, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm processing. Interesting. I realized my marriage for the last 6 months has felt really distant, and I felt like a heavy load of work, and I'm withdrawing in this way. And it's almost, it takes me, I'm just a slow learner, but it takes me a long time to kind of come to like almost turn back and be like, oh, I'm trying to calm myself down a lot. And I didn't realize I was doing that, or I really didn't realize how much I'm dependent on my clients for meeting this need in myself or whatever. I feel like, I don't know, it's interesting that we get to do it so long term, because it seems like each season, like you're saying, there's just the ups and downs. I feel that in a big way too, like, oh, over the last 9 months, my friends were dealing with that and this was happening, and now I'm recognizing I'm dealing with it this way, and it kind of takes a while. And then that's been different in different seasons. Like, I feel like there's been seasons where social life is really busy and rich and feel really intimate with people. And then seasons where I'm like, I just want to hole up in my house. And I don't know, just the different impact at different moments. Feels really varied, I guess, to me. I'm just thinking back over like 15 years, like, wow, it's been really, really different in different seasons.
Yeah, I'm just thinking from this conversation more about yeah, being able to be our own messy selves, even while we are in the therapist role, and how counterintuitive that can feel at times. And I know sometimes for me, I have this like internal commentary, like when I really need like 4+ days to like get fully out of like therapist mode, like when I'm on like a vacation, and then I'll have this thought of like, oh, I'm just a person and this feels so good. And then it's like, well, what does that mean the rest of the time that I just a person? And so I think that has so much to do with it too, of like, how confined in the role are you? And even like, what are you like subscribing to about like what the role of a therapist is supposed to be? Or even, I think Tyshell brought up a good point too, of like, yeah, that there can be these stereotypes, and then it feels bad if you're like outside of it. Like, I remember in grad school, we had to take the strong interest inventory, and it would show like what your interests were. And most of us, it was all like focused on people. And then there were like 1 or 2 people where they scored really high in like these business things. And they felt really bad, like, oh, am I not supposed to be like in this career if I'm, or like some people who just had a little bit more of like um a directive edge. And it's like there's room for so many different like approaches in therapy, and so many different personalities that really speak to people. Yet, I don't know, it's easy to get disempowered or feel like kind of boxed in, and that can absolutely like have a toll.
Yeah, I think there's something to like when you come in at the beginning of this and I'll just speak for myself. I'm like drawn to it. Okay. There's a calling there. Something is very real there, but I don't know anything about what it means to do the work. And then kind of identifying some entryway in and then using those as like kind of ideals to move towards. And then at some point, it's like trying on the mask of that version of a therapist, and you learn a bunch of things, but you realize like, oh, that doesn't fit. Like that is not, that's an abstract shape, or that's somebody else who found their way into the work and like wrote about it or developed some teaching around it that could be really useful ingredients, but ultimately like has to be me doing it. And there was some point in which I realized like I have to really believe something if I'm going to say it with the client. So I actually can't just borrow lightly something that I'm not into, because the depth of it is not there. Like I can only say the one kind of title of it. And if there's any pushback or if it's not landing, I'm like, oh, never mind, don't worry about it. Whereas if I believe something, I can talk about it many ways. It doesn't matter to me as much if they find it super useful. It's just one of many things I'm offering. It's something I find to be personally useful, but that's like a whole different process then versus like reading something or having other people teach me about how they're doing it. Like I kind of have to take it on myself, which just takes longer time and is not clear exactly when it kind of fully enters my system versus when I'm trying it on. Like, so it's harder to pin down.
I think that totally speaks to you, Chris. I'm glad you said that. And I freaking love this training so much. It's like really speaking to me today in particular. So a couple of things. This was a while ago now, but I was walking down First Avenue on my way to work, and there's a hair shop. So I'm going back to Tyshell. You mentioned something about this, but there's a hair shop up there, and there's like a sandwich board outside, and it says something like, "Come get your hair cut. It's cheaper than therapy." And I was like, "Oh, this is the part of this, like the self-critical part, Marcus, that you mentioned at the beginning that came up." I was like, "Oh my God, maybe they're right." Maybe they're right. And I was like, what am I, like, how am I showing up in that moment? It's like these little kind of interesting things that happen in like real life, that make me pause for a second and go like, wow, am I being kind of hard on myself? Or even like being a social worker, in like psychotherapy is even different for me, having a different degree. And it makes me pause for a second and go like, my school that I came from, my school of thought is like, you know nothing, like embrace it, you don't know anything. And that's like so comforting to me until I walk by those sandwich boards. It's like haircuts are cheaper than therapy, and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know enough. It's fascinating to me to like come across these like moments in time, or like conversations with coworkers or something like that, or friends or whomever, that makes me kind of come back to that centered place of like, okay, I think I can show up as me. So anyway, thank you for this, I really like it.
I had a really similar experience last week, Kristen. I was at yoga, and in the restroom afterwards, people clean up, and this woman's next to me, and she was saying how long she'd been at the studio. And she's like, yeah, I was deciding, should I do yoga or therapy? And I decided yoga was cheaper and more helpful. And I'm there too. Like, I love yoga. I find it very therapeutic. Like, it's a wonderful space. And I'm agreeing with her. And then she asked about me and what I do. And I'm like, oh, I'm a therapist. And it was such a great conversation, and brought up in me too, like, both the belief that there's lots of ways to go about. And I love the shift from healing, maybe healing not being the right word even for what our job is, but lots of ways to take care of ourselves. And I had to come back to like, good for her. She chose that way. Great. Good for me. I also believe in this. There's lots of ways to go about this, find the fun. Yeah, it just was an interesting, like, in my face. Yeah, sure, cheaper, and it probably just as helpful for you. So great.
Yeah, I'm taking both of those. I'm like looking at the other way. Therapy being a reference point for what's really, really helpful,
Oh, I love that,
even though it's being compared against that. And also like, hey, yeah, it's expensive. Hey, yeah, it's actually hard, really hard. Not that yoga isn't hard or whatever. But it's like actually they're associating themselves with therapy as a thing, because but I think it's also this mixed relationship that a lot of people have with therapy. They're like, oh, that's really good, but it's too expensive, or does it even work? But there's clearly I need to figure something out.
And I thought two of the things too, like to both of those for Kristen and Rachel, the hair thing is like you sit in a chair and you are having a conversation often, especially if you get to know the same person, same hairstylist, and you leave feeling better about yourself because you look better. And then for yoga, you're engaging your body. So those are parts of therapy. I'm just not doing your hair while we're talking about it. But the thing for me is, I think there's also specific things like me and my niece, and in my culture, we also laugh about hair depression. You're like, I thought I was depressed, but I just needed my hair done. But so I'll say that. I just said to my niece the other day, like, oh, I'm just cured my hair depression, because I was like, my hair, I didn't like the way my hair looked and I did it. So I was like, oh, I cured my hair depression. But and it also, we joke about it because it's gonna happen again. Because at some point I'm gonna be like, oh, I need my hair done again, and that's gonna pop back up. So it's this cyclical relationship. But I think I would tell someone, or I would engage with someone and be like, yeah, like you should do yoga. Like, you can do all of these things. I was actually just learning today about mindfulness walks, and I was like, oh, this is great. I want to do this in addition. So I always talk to people when I worked with students, especially, I'd say certain things are therapeutic, but they're not therapy, because sometimes they become a new coping mechanism. Like, I look good because I got my hair done, so I feel good, but you haven't dealt with the underlying things that made you not look good. Like, I love getting my hair done. I love the way my hair looks, but I haven't dealt with the societal pressures of what it means to be a Black woman in a society where I'm living up to white beauty standards. That's it. That's a lot to unpack. I just want to get my hair done today. It's okay. I was so stressed in my body because of all of the things that I'm dealing with. And I went to Bikram yoga. It's hot and my body feels less stressed, but I haven't dealt with the underlying issues of what was stressing me out. So I think that they go in tandem, but I love things like that. And to Kristen, to what you were saying, also I'm a social worker as well. And it was very much like, like I always tell people, I may not be the person, but I'm the resource. That was like my program was like, you're a resource.
Mm.
But the thing that I took, and one of my biggest lessons in learning in life is as a social worker, we work in so many different fields. And I had a visiting professor, Sandy Schramm, who's worked a lot with welfare and sanctions and things. And he said, he came visiting to our classroom and he said, well, in social work, you have to decide if you're going to be a social agent of control or a social agent of change. And that has stuck with me almost 10 years I've been out of school, because in social work, you can work in the government, you can work in prisons, and you can control a lot of people's lives, especially at the most, which is how I got into DEI work, because I knew we were dealing with people at the most vulnerable times in their life, prison, hospitals, children, all of those things. And I could have so much influence over them that DEI needed to be a part of that for me, but also understanding that I can be a social agent of change for people, right? Not for what I need, but for what you may need, and be a resource. So that's kind of how I thought about it in mind. But it was like, oh, I don't know. Like I'm very comfortable telling people I don't know something. Like, oh, I don't know that. People are like, Tasha, and I also got voted Miss Know-It-All in 8th grade and 12th grade superlatives. But I would be like, no. I'm confident to talk about the things that I know, but there's a whole list of things that I have no idea about. Like, you start throwing multiplication times at me and things like that, problems, I can't help you at all. Like, I can't help us in an escape room with that. Like,
Mhm. Becca and Kathy, I'm really curious if anything's love to invite your thoughts in if you have anything you'd like to share.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe this is like backtracking a little bit, but I appreciated, Erin, what you were kind of sharing about like just kind of like fitting into like what you're supposed to be as a therapist or what you're not supposed to be as a therapist. And I think something that really came up for me that I was just like thinking about was like going to grad school for art therapy and like going into this program and remembering like what it was like to be like, oh, am I fitting the mold of what I'm supposed to do? You know, we'd sit down and they'd have us like doing some sort of visualization or mindfulness at the start of certain workshops or lectures. And I'm like, I'm sitting there like this just isn't speaking to me. Like mindfulness isn't working for me. And then like the people to either side of me are like, wow, like that just like brought me to tears, that bubble. And I'm just like, okay, am I like fitting this mold? It's just like, and I just, when you were kind of sharing that, that just really resonated with me a lot. And I think since that point, like have definitely just kind of like established more of like, what are my interests? What are my niches? Like, how can I, encourage my own clients to be like, look, mindfulness doesn't work for everyone. Like, let's practice some mindfulness while you're folding your laundry, or let's like find things that are in like that. I think just having that experience has definitely helped for like, we don't have to fit into certain molds or whatever, but I think, yeah, anyway, that's something that came to mind for me.
I think
That
that's
also
such a cool.
makes me, oh, go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, well, I just think that's such a cool point, even with where we all went to school and the degrees we have, like you're talking about social worker versus, I come from a neuropsych background where that I was really passionate about that. And kind of like, in some ways, we joked about you drink the Kool-Aid of your program. And you really believe in the modalities you love, which is great because they're working for you and you're resonating with them. But then it can be easy to dismiss other ones. And this is where I felt so grateful for self spaces, because you get to watch, at this point, like 35 folks practicing from different modalities. And when they're passionate and like you're saying, like, oh, this actually fits me, Marcus, like I can say this because I believe in it and I really mean this, or I can really resonate with this way of thinking about what we're even doing here. It just is so much more enlivening. Like when you think about sustainability, it's like, yeah, for you to practice a kind of art therapy that doesn't resonate with you, you're not going to do that for 30 years. Like, you die in that. So yeah, it just is so interesting to have like a real-time perspective with our whole team of watching someone doing DBT and someone doing art, and someone doing somatic stuff, and how just when they're in their sweet spot, it's inspiring to me. And helps me get out of my sense of like, oh, there's one way to be a therapist that's the best, or the most whatever. And Erin, I know I kind of jumped in at the same time, so I'm done.
It's funny thinking about the two social workers here. I think there's just the two of you in this conversation. I mean, my school is a lot about like systems and about doing your own like experiential work with your family of origin and culture of origin. But I was like, you know, very drawn to the emotional connectivity and wanting to, that's where I want to be. And then being in some of these community health jobs where really the social work skills were needed. Like helping someone get housing is like a prerequisite to them, you know, functioning better, feeling better, all of the things. And I was like, I didn't think of myself as wanting to knowing how to do those things really, or having a strong interest in those things. And yet when it was actually a person in front of me and then multiple people, I then had a real reason, a meaningful reason to me to pick up those skills and to find the resources. And that was never going to be my full like work life because of how I am. But in those, I was like, oh, I get this now. Like I get how important it is. I get how it feels to connect someone to a resource they were unaware of that really changes where their life is at in a given time. And I mean, I know those are like obvious things on paper, like the difference between having housing or like living in a bad housing situation versus having your own stable housing. But the felt like experience for me, like really kind of popped some of my own preconceptions about what doing real therapy was, which was like equal to me of like emotional healing only, you know, like moving through getting more adept with like navigating your emotional life and also show me how simplistic that was. But you have to start somewhere also. Like there's, I don't know. So that was just percolating as we're talking. You know. And Riley, I don't
Good, right. Yeah, Riley was going to say something earlier. So
I don't know. I don't want to put you on the spot, or maybe I do want to put you on the spot. I'm
What's
interested
up?
in how some of your, you know, your more like social political perspectives also
Yeah.
weave into the parts of this conversation.
Oh yeah, I mean everything you were just saying was reminding me of it. And Tashelle and Kristen, you know, I'm not a social worker. I have a master's in existential psychology, but I come from a background of studying military history, excuse me, military history and sociology, super systemic perspective. I worked in a forensic mental health program for a while before coming to self space, and I think this hooks into like a different question I have that feels related, which is just like I'm a big proponent of the idea that like suffering is really necessary for healing, and that, you know, to touch on what you said earlier about like agent of social control versus agent of change, to me that's just like a divide that dominates the entire field of social work, psychology, psychotherapy. There's like so many ways in which it's used as an avenue of social control and so many ways in which it is not and is a space for more genuine healing or connection. And I think I'm always kind of asking myself the question of like, when is somebody actually like suffering from something that's actually like pretty solvable? Like medically, getting housing, getting a new job. I mean, I have a client who the other day I said to him, like, hey, normally I'm like directing you inward to feel your feelings. And right now it seems like you actually need to get a job because you're running out of money. Like, I think do something, you know? And that was really interesting to me because I had no problem saying it. But you know, no, I've lost my thoughts and there's too many things going on. But I think for me, it's just like there are a lot of ways in which it's yeah, when to be direct with. No, I've totally lost my thoughts. I'm sorry, I gotta let it go. Yeah.
I know for me, anytime I'm getting more dogmatic about any approach, it's like all conceptual and it's not really embodied and relational. And I think that's the bit like about when I put some social work time in, it was like, actually that was relational and embodied in that time. And I think, Riley, what you're saying, it's like, well, what's actually needed here now? Is it directedness? Is it openness? Is it inwardness? Is it environmental? And like, it's so specific to the person and what's happening in their life and what the relationship that you have with them is like. It's like, you can't really give an abstract version of like what to do when X.
Thinking about that too. So I worked we had internships in my social work program, and one I was working in a co-occurring disorder safe haven. So folks who could not make it in the shelter system with co-occurring disorders, with substance abuse, mental health, things like that. And those are some of the most resilient people I've ever met in my entire life. Like in my entire life, they've been through so much. And this is like in Philadelphia, it's street homelessness. So it's not like couch surfing. You have to be contacted by someone on the street to be able to get into some of these programs. But the program itself is housing first. So that, because so many shelter systems say you have to be drug free, but it's like, you know how many people do drugs at home? Like, so there's a housing first system. And thinking about that, when you were talking about the need for housing and needs like that, I was thinking about, it made me go back to school and say Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I can't think about my existential self
Right.
if I don't have any food to eat. Like, I need to be able to nourish my body before I can start thinking about my higher self, right? Like the actual grounded part. Like before I can get here, I need to solve here, or I need to solve here. Like thinking about all of those different parts of a person and social, and like in social work, they call it social determinants of health, right? Like before I can get to the doctor, before I can take the medication that's going to make me better, how am I getting to the doctors? What is my transportation? Right? Like, can I get there? So we had a very interesting ways of learning about mental health. Like I have my DSM is on my shelf and it has all of the tabs in it. But like I never really open it to determine who a person is, right? Like you have to because I always tell people like you could have, if you read the DSM, you could have 17 different mental health issues. That's how they market drugs to people very often. Like, do you feel bad on Tuesdays? And you're like, I did feel bad last Tuesday, right? But because we ebb and flow out of these things. So understanding the maladjustment, but also understanding that people are going in and out of things all of the time, and being able to collectively understand themselves is really important, and how they're relating to whatever that environment is from a social work perspective is always how I think about it. But I was one of those people, I didn't know what social work was, even though some of you heard me the other day saying I'm a third generation social worker. We didn't, my grandmother and grandmother don't have degrees in social work, right? Like I did a BA in psychology, and my professor was like, you should get a degree in social work. I was like, not knowing that it was a part of life that I was doing anyway. So it came really natural. But then this is how I got into DEI, because I was seeing that people were missing parts of things. Like they wanted to fix the people, but they weren't looking at all of the parts of the things and the intersectionality of the person, right? Like what are they dealing with that helps them get to where they need to heal, or as much, or they can live with whatever is happening, versus it healing. Because most scars that we've had, we all can look at a scar on our body and recall what happened, and we live with that scar. It's not gone completely. Sometimes they go away completely, but most of the time they don't. You're now living with it, and it reminds you of something painful, but something you got through. I love quotes. I'm one of those like, you conquered every bad day you've had so far, right? Like you've lived through all of them so far. I love quotes. That's a huge thing, especially in my culture as well. But like learning that you living with these things, they're not gone. You can't erase. It's not like Men in Black where you can erase your memory and you're starting over again. And would you want to? If you ask most people, they might want to remember, they might want to take parts away, but most people wouldn't want to erase their entire memory, right? Like if you really ask people. So I think about that as well.
I'm really resonating with something you had said, Marcus, earlier about like that, tapping into more like social worker offerings for clients like can be the most embodied thing at times versus, other times it's like sitting with people in that emotional work. And something about that just felt really grounding to me because I think even when I'm getting swept up in this, confined role of what I'm supposed to be as a therapist, like that does get to a really cerebral place versus like if I am just focusing on being embodied and then kind of playing off of what Riley was saying, and that can include just being really expressive and uncomfortable with the client in the moment, just how much more like human and messy and good that feels. So yeah, something about like that almost being like the focus or the anchor of like, I don't know, focusing on what feels resonant or embodied, even if it's like distressing, feels like it's a good, I don't know, compass.
Sure. I know the more distressed I am, the more I want to move away from any of those sensations. And that's when the conceptual thing will drum up all sorts of uh, directions to go or interpretations. Whereas, like, when it's much more rooted and this is all connected, it just feels so different, regardless of what offering is coming. It just feels so different. It feels really sustainable. It feels repeatable. It doesn't feel like I have to solve this or I have to prove something. It's just like I'm curious. I think to Rachel's point, I'm like in my body, regardless of what's going on. I still have ideas about what I think's happening or what would be helpful, but it's like the proportions are just so different. They're working together. They're not feeling like polarities or there's not as much of an urgency around any particular part of it.
Another thing I'm thinking about, there's been a strange amount of this popping up in just conversations with other therapists of like times where you might be naked in front of a client. Like, and it's just funny, like I took this ethics training and the guy was like, yeah, there's times where that's ethical. And I was like, what? And he was mentioning like, oh yeah, when I go to the gym and a client happens to be also changing in the locker room there, like that's ethical. Or and just even
Oh my
I've
God.
had a client recently who like saw another service provider like at like some like kind of a nude spa and like that brought up things and then talking with um another therapist about like wanting like them wanting to explore like going to a nude beach but then oh what if a client sees me and I even think that's really interesting, the ways that like there's like the literal sense of, oh, I don't want clients to see me naked, but there's also the emotional sense sometimes of like, oh, I don't want them to see like the raw, real messy me. And even like the degrees that we go to of like, well, am I just gonna live my life? And if they see me in my raw, messy, um, literal or metaphorical like naked self, am I just going to allow that or am I going to like kind of hide away and not like do these different life experiences? um like I even think about that. I'm not even necessarily like much of a drinker, but I know I've thought about like, oh yeah, if I was to like go out and be wild or something, like, oh, I'd never want to do that, what if a client would see me? And it's just like it's I think that can be another interesting hang up of like, I don't know, yeah, again, wanting to like kind of hide behind this like therapist version that's very clean and and covered up.
I should actually like share something that has been just like an interesting sort of thing to grapple with myself. I just recently moved, and in the house right next door to me is actually a patient that I know from my previous job. I didn't work with individually, but I worked closely with in like the group settings and other things. And it's just been very interesting to kind of like sit with that and be like, they will inevitably for years to come, like see me. And like this is in the past, like this is a while back now, but like it's just so that like your naked self, like seeing you in your like most vulnerable, you're at your home, you're comfortable, whether, you have much interaction with your neighbors or not. It's just, yeah, been very, I think, interesting. And also just to think about how your client, like, oh, this person knows some of very vulnerable things about me and just kind of thinking about that, I don't know, has been, yeah, interesting thing to navigate.
There's an interesting thing I thought was funny about that. There's an episode of The Nanny, which 90s TV show, where she sees her therapist at a movie theater. He's picking his nose. And the conversation that they end up having about it, she's talking to her boss who sent her to therapy. And she's like, he did this obscene thing in public. And he thought she did something. He went in to confront the therapist because he thought the therapist had done something sexual, but really it was just picking his nose. And then they had an entire session about like, what is decency, what isn't decency. But I think about that too, like when you're a kid, when you're a child and you see your teacher out of context. Like the first time I used to work in a classroom with toddlers, and the first time in a school 0 to 6, and the first time a child saw me at the grocery store, they were like, Miss Tyshell, how are you here?
Yeah.
Like
Are you
a
a real person? Like what? Yeah.
And there's a book about a teacher, Miss So-and-so lives in room 232. It's like a children's book from years ago. But like seeing a person in their full self can be jarring, but also can be helpful because you can see more dimensions of a person, and it's the same. That's the thing I was thinking, tracking back to what I was thinking about parents. Like, I don't see my parents as these perfect entities. I see them as people who had children along in their lives. So trying to unmask that perfect thing that we think about people and seeing that. But it can be jarring because maybe you don't want that person, maybe that person doesn't want to see you and they're like, oh my God, you know way more about me than I would want my neighbor to know about me. So I worked with kids and they would say, oh, don't say hello to a child in person if you see one of the students, because we worked with kids in foster care who were in the shelter system. So they were like, let them say hello to you. But I didn't, I saw a child out once, or a young person out once, and they were like, why'd you ignore me? I saw you and you didn't say anything. So like sometimes it feels like that as well. So you can say, I would have to tell people like, hey, if you see me in person, I probably won't speak, but you're welcome to say hello. But like just seeing, like being a whole person, because it's helpful, but it also can be really jarring to see it as well.
That's that I practiced in Duval for a while, which is a small town, and so we would give that spiel every client. Like we probably will see each other around, and a client, and yeah, and I won't say hello unless you say hello first, because I don't want to have to, like, you don't have to explain, oh, that's my therapist, if you're with somebody, or if you just don't want to deal with that. And I remember when someone saw me buying groceries, and I felt like, oh, I feel like they see what I'm eating, and it's like the arrange, like the control, right? The arrangement is like in the room, or at the time, from this time to this time, and at this place. And then when it's like just life happens outside of that, it is like, it's surprising. However you handle it, it's just you're not like expecting it.
Well, I think it's interesting because it's like we have control as the therapist
Yeah.
in the dynamic, and then it's like all of a sudden we don't have the control, like when they're seeing us like out in the wild. Yeah, like I can remember seeing a client once and I was shopping for clothes and they came up and they're like, hi Erin, that's a very cute dress that you're looking at. And I'm like, "See you later." And I was like, so that even felt interesting having them see my shopping process. But something about that even feels kind of like humbling to think about too, of like, oh, like we're getting to change the tables and I'm not in that like maybe safe, comfortable, high control role, and we get to kind of be more on equal footing, and it's uncomfortable and vulnerable, yet also that something feels important in that too.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and maybe we can just go around a little bit and say what it was like to have this conversation today. What is kind of popping out for you as we finish up. I know for me it's just been wonderful, and part of what, regardless of like the content of any of these trainings, having this connection with you all, with community of therapists, is deeply settling for my nervous system. Feeling very understood, feeling very seen and recognized and exchanged with. And it's part of something that I find very, very valuable about doing this. So, thank you all.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Marcus, for putting this on, and I feel similarly of that sense of camaraderie around kind of everyone trying to figure this out in ourselves and then together. And I'm just struck by the word flexible kept being in my head through this talk. Just like, wow, our job just requires so much flexibility. Like we're changing ideas about what we're doing. I mean, you might go in, I feel like for myself, go into the work one week and kind of have this as a focus, then because I'm learning something new, this is a new way of seeing the work, and just the flexibility of emotions and the flexibility of what it looks like to care for ourselves or relate to ourselves and people, just a sense of how healthy that feels, to change modalities, help someone find housing, and then to be really deeply internal and just, I don't know, keep expanding the range of that. That feels important to me at this time. So.
I'm definitely resonating with, yeah, both of what you're saying, Rachel and Marcus, that yeah, I mean, so much of our to Marcus's point, so much of our work is witnessing others, that I think many of us, but like certainly I feel this intense need to like be also witnessed, and like we can be so siloed as therapists that it is so refreshing where it's like, oh yeah, you have that experience too, or you go through this nuance and this like awkward, uncomfy stuff too. Um, I think what I'm really taking away from the conversation that I was really needing is to really think about and challenge the expectations I put on the role of a therapist, and that feels like a much more sustainable thing for me to focus on, is like how to, I don't know, be forcing myself to conform as little as possible, as far as like trying to, if I'm a round peg, forcing myself into a square hole or whatever, and just trying to, I don't know, throw out that shape and just kind of make room for the way that I'm going to show up most authentically or embodied. So yeah, I'm really grateful for this conversation.
I concur. I feel like I've been a bobblehead like this whole time. I'm like, yeah, yes, 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 yes. Like that totally makes so much sense to me. But I appreciate everyone coming together because I just listening to you all talk about this, I can sense myself becoming more and more settled like over the course of like our training, like in our conversation. And I really needed that today. So I just want to maybe say like thank you because I just really needed this.
I would echo that. I think just like having this sense of community is really great, especially just in light of a lot of change and like newness. It's just nice to feel like connected, and I think just like what's the word? Like just a common experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I've appreciated this too. I mean, I feel like the end of the conversation more and more going towards like, oh, being a person as being a therapist, like those are not incompatible, and the flexibility, Rachel, you spoke to. And one thing I've been saying lately that I don't fully understand, but it's felt right to say, is that I identify more as a participant in therapy than a practitioner of therapy. That's like very, very, very important to the way I come to the work. And not that I like insist on my perspective in the room. I still think I step into the role, but like there's something about my own process being ultimately what I'm engaged in. Like to Marcus, of your point, like if I don't actually believe it, I cannot say it in good faith. And somehow like my participation in therapy feels very connected to that way of practicing as a therapist.
A lot of this for me was internal because I'm experiencing a lot of things at once. So this is like my first week with self space. This is my first training with self space. Also, I'm healing from a lot of like work trauma. So like being in a space where like I wouldn't do this in corporate America. Like I also was not interested in necessarily doing it, but also I'm in a so I in my head I'm like, have I talked too much? Did I say the right things? Or are people like, oh, she, because I also, because thinking about being an extrovert where other people may be introverts, I'm like, do they think this girl talks too damn much? Right. Like I've been doing, that's a battle I've faced my whole life. And my therapist goes, you're an out loud processor. It's okay. But also the thing that like has been really internal for me in this moment has been like, I deal with especially from work, a lot of racial trauma. So at work, I've often been the only person of color, only woman of color on a call. And for me, when I step into that space, there's so much trepidation in there because people can be intimidated by my educational level or what have you, but then also treat me really poorly because of that, right? So the last time I was on a Zoom at work, it was really traumatic because I felt like the only because I was often the only. But I haven't felt this in this conversation. So towards the end of this, being able to feel the connection in the conversation has felt differently, which is why I credit Marcus and Rachel with even the process of coming to Self Space. They felt like conversations versus like a strict interview, right? Like they felt like I was able to have a conversation with someone. So it feels different and it feels right. But sometimes in having all of the jobs I've had over my life, the coming to a second career or third career, to be honest, you get interviewed and you don't necessarily, I've never worked at a corporate job and felt like, I believe in this mission. It's because the mission is usually to make money. And I'm like, I don't care. But I've wanted to get there. I just didn't never know if it was possible. So I feel differently in this, but also I'm still having to work through that racial trauma of being an only and what that means. And do people, as Erin, you were saying, do people see me when I show up? Can I be like, there's so much like, can I say this? If I say this, is it going to be labeled a certain way? Are people going to look at things? So there's a lot of that I'll probably be processing in a lot of the trainings and coming to these conversations, but that's always been something. But this being able to have the conversation and for me to even say this is a big step because I wouldn't have otherwise. So thank you for the space feeling so open to be able to do that as well. And it makes me think about the sustainability of being able to do this kind of work, to be able to be myself in it, because you can't not be yourself in therapy work because clients, just like teenagers, clients can always tell when you're being fake. Like it's like a sniff test. They're like, no, I don't like this. And I want people to be able to bring their vulnerable selves. So I have to like be okay being a vulnerable person in that situation, which does not work in corporate America. Just if you had to do it, just know that it doesn't work very often. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Kathy, I just want to give you the opportunity if you want to say anything.
Not really. I'm just here bouncing the baby and listening.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here today and for this really rich conversation. I think I keep being struck, but that therapy is like a conversational medium. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to me, these conversations being really a natural kind of format of ways to engage in this stuff.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you all so much. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Marcus. Bye, guys.